Hello again everybody and welcome back to Inspirational Landscapes. At this point in the course we need a straightforward case study that you can use as a focal point for tying together some of the ideas that we've discussed previously. The idea of using glaciers for this case study isn't that you necessarily have to know all about glaciers, it's that you should be trying to do the same thing as we're going to do now for glaciers with the case study landscape of your choice. Whatever landscape you're particularly interested in, rivers, volcanoes, cities, the rural, you can do to that what we're about to do, or what we're about to see other people doing to glaciers. Even if you don't have glaciers in your own back garden or in your own country or in your own region, pretty much everybody is familiar with what a glacier is, and they're familiar with the idea of glaciers as being part of our environment. Most of you will either have maybe visited a glacier or seen glaciers on TV, read about them in books, you'll have studied them maybe at school geography. And if you haven't visited a glacier yourself, you'll know somebody who has. Or maybe you've visited landscapes left behind by glaciers even though the glaciers are no longer there. A lot of you watching this in the UK, you might have visited the Lake District, for example, and you'll be familiar, or North Wales, and you'll be familiar with the glaciated landscapes of the Lake District, North Wales and other parts of the country, even though we no longer have glaciers. And my guess, and we'll check this out in one of our live sessions, but my guess is that even though probably very few of you have actually been to Antarctica, my guess is that most of you believe in the Antarctic ice sheet. You're not really in any doubt that there are glaciers and there are ice sheets, even in places where you've never personally been to visit them and to check up on them. Glaciers are thoroughly embedded within our view of the world. When we think of the world around us, we don't kind of wonder too much about whether there are glaciers or whether they come and go, whether they advance and retreat in response to climate change. We already know that, we take that for granted. But that's actually a pretty new thing. It's only a couple of hundred years since people realised that glaciers have in the past been more extensive than they are today, that there have been ice ages, that glaciers come, glaciers go, they're ephemeral, and that they change in response to changes in climate. And that recognition of the importance of glaciers, the significance of glaciers and the place of glaciers in the physical environment has also had an impact, it's made a difference to our whole way of looking at the world, not just our physical appreciation of the world around us, but also an appreciation of our position in the world relative to the time scales and the spatial scales over which physical events operate. And so we can talk about a cultural shift, if you like, in our attitude to glaciers, or our understanding and appreciation of glaciers. And we can call that the glacial turn, the change in our attitude to glaciers that has occurred over a relatively recent period of human history. Now, before we get into the detail of talking about different ways that people have looked at glaciers and thought about glaciers and talked about glaciers, I'd like you just to pause for a minute, pause the video and have a think about this, and just have some ideas of your own about exactly what you think about glaciers, what you already know about glaciers, what you imagine about glaciers, what you wonder about glaciers. And the reason I want you to do this is because one of the important questions right now is whether we all have the same kind of metaphorical language, if you like, or iconography of glaciers. So if I say to you, oh, it was utterly glacial, or oh, that was just like a glacier, or something like that, if I use glacier as a metaphor for something, or as an adjective, are we all speaking the same language? And I want to extend that to landscape terms in general. When we see a particular landscape or landscape type, does that make the same impression on us all? Because if it does, then we can use those landscape terms or landscape types as some kind of shared language. But if they don't, if we all respond in completely different ways and have completely different ideas about what the essence of glacier, what the essence of desert, what the essence of garden is, if we have completely different ideas about that, then we can't really use the landscapes as a shorthand for expressing an idea. So just pause the video now and take a while and think about what are the big labels. If you had to just put some bullet points to go under the word, the heading is glaciers, what big bullet points would you put under there? What do you already know about the science? I know some of you have done a module with me previously about glacier science, so maybe you know a lot about the science. Do not know anything about the science. What would you use glacial or glacier maybe as a metaphor for? If you're writing a novel or writing a poem, what would you use a glacier to represent or to describe? Or what analogy or what image would you use to represent or to describe the key characteristics of a glacier? Suppose you were writing an opera. What would the opera be like if its focus was glaciers? Write me a poem, write me a haiku about glacier, and just try to get a feeling for what your feeling is about glaciers, what your impression of glaciers is before we start. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just that as we embark on any section of this course, it's useful to pause for a minute before you kick off and just make sure that you have an idea of what you already think. So what do you already think about glaciers? Pause the video here for a second, jot a few things down, and come back when you're ready. Now for this section of the module, there's some very, very strongly suggested reading, not just because I wrote the book, but because this book was written specifically with this module, this course in mind. So this is Glacier, Nature and Culture that I produced a couple of years ago. And there's a lot of material here which ties directly to what we're talking about today. So if you want some elaboration on the basic points that I'm covering here, this book is for sure the place to go. For the Keele students doing this module, there are multiple copies of this in the Keele library, and you can get an electronic version through the library reading list for this module. So you should have no trouble at all getting hold of this book, and it's kind of the set reading for this part of the module. Now, when I was writing this book and doing the research for it and thinking about what I wanted to emphasise and how I wanted to tell my story about Glacier, one of the recurring themes that came up was the one that I mentioned in that previous slide, the idea of Glacier as metaphor. So we can use Glacier, like other landscape items, as part of some shared language that we can use the glacier to represent something, and other people will know what we mean. And while I was putting together the book, I came across this album by a musician called Ned Self, and the album is called Glaciers Come, Glaciers Go. And I saw this and I listened to some of the music, and I thought, well, I love the music, I love the title, but I don't quite understand why this title, Glaciers Come, Glaciers Go, was what this chap used to label his music. It's steel guitar music, he's based in Hawaii, the tracks on the album aren't about glaciers. So I wrote to him and I said, so what's going on? Why have you called this Glaciers? What was your thinking when you decided to call your album Glaciers Come, Glaciers Go? And I tell the story about that in the book here, so I'll just read you what I said. The musician Ned Self grew up in the deep south of the USA before moving to Hawaii. His main instrument is a steel guitar. In 1995, when he produced his first album, he chose the title Glaciers Come, Glaciers Go. It didn't seem an obvious choice of title for a new age rock jazz album out of Hawaii, so I wrote to ask him why. He explained that he wanted an image that would allude to the transitory nature of human consciousness. We all tend to inflate our current problem or obsession into a giant megalith that seems forever unchanging and all-consuming, he said, when in fact it will soon melt and fade into the next thing that will occupy our thoughts. He told me that the idea of using glacier for that metaphor came from his reading of M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Travelled. Writing about how we choose a map for our life, Peck wrote, "The biggest problem of map making is not that we have to start from scratch, but that if our maps are to be accurate, we have to continually revise them. The world itself is constantly changing. Glaciers come, glaciers go. Cultures come, cultures go. The vantage point from which we view the world is constantly and quite rapidly changing. We must continually revise our maps." Well, I'm sure that will ring a bell for students doing this module. Having to continually revise our maps because they don't reflect a changing reality, well, that's an idea that we've come across before. But that's a nice example of using a glacier as a metaphor. What we all think we know about glaciers, the size, the slowness, their impressive nature, the fact that they are ephemeral, they come, they go, they respond to other changes in the environment. Because of that essence of what a glacier is, we all know that, we all share that idea, so we can use it to represent our thoughts about some other topic. And that again is something that we're encountering over and over again in this module. So having spoken to Ned Self and thought about those ideas that he put forward and read what Scott Peck said in his book, here's what I wrote at the very end of my Glacier book. Some things are unimaginable. Eternity, the end of the world. Most of us don't really engage with those things. Other things are trivial and make up most of our daily lives. Glaciers lie somewhere between the two. On the one hand, they're graspable, real-world objects and we can visit and touch, and even if we don't visit them, we can easily form an image of them in our mind. But on the other hand, they are connected to the vast, the sublime, the other. They give us a link, a glimpse, a way of approaching the unimaginable, a way of seeing more beyond the obvious, through that boundary between vision and imagination. Glaciers are a reminder and they're a relic of something we could have forgotten. Humanity has seen only a tiny fraction of history, and so we've witnessed only some of the things that have happened, some of the things that can happen, and that they're things that will happen again. We missed, obviously, the Big Bang. We don't remember the origins of life. We missed the dinosaurs, and we haven't seen any big meteorite impacts. We missed the Altai and the Missoula floods. We nearly missed the glaciers. The Earth's remaining glaciers are like mammoths in the zoo, linking us to a past that has largely disappeared, or that we could have entirely forgotten. Of course, we have no mammoths in the zoo, but we do still have glaciers, for a while. As a scientist, I use the mammoth analogy, and regret that I couldn't have witnessed the Missoula floods. Were I not a scientist, I might cite not the mammoth, but the unicorn. There are no unicorns to link us to that metaphysical, imaginary, magical world. But for those of us who are so inclined, glaciers can do the same. They are grander than the normal scope of human comprehension. They enable us to see the world in a way, in a context, at a scale that we would otherwise struggle to notice. And that's what this module is about, trying to notice things that we otherwise wouldn't do by seeing them from a particular perspective, or by using, in this case, a particular analogy that can somehow tie a link between our human scale and the landscape scale, the global scale, the cosmic scale. That's what we're trying to do in this module. That's one of the things we're trying to do in this module. Now, another artist citing Glacier as inspiration that I encountered during the production of this book was another musician called Peter Broderick. And a similar kind of situation arose where I was looking at his music, listening to his music. And on one of his albums, he had tracks that were labelled, well, there was one called Glacier, a Glacier, another one called Another Glacier. And I did the same thing. I wrote to him and I said, well, these are great, love your music, but why have you called it Glacier? What's the thinking behind that label? And he said, well, I was thinking about glaciers when I made that music, the apparent simplicity of them, but also this sort of grand mysteriousness. And he said, with that music, I really loved this image of an enormous block of ice slowly creeping along. I had that picture in my head while writing most of the music for that album. So again, with Peter Broderick, as with Ned Self, it's that idea that Glacier gives you an idea, it puts something into your mind. When you think about Glacier, it gives you a certain set of images or ideas or feelings or responses, and the music is then a reflection of those responses to the landscape. So there's that connection, the landscape into yourself and yourself into the creative process. And that's something that I guess some of you are engaging with right now in terms of the projects that you're writing in association with this module. I've put a couple of links on this page. The first one there is to a piece of music with Glacier in the title. This is another Glacier, so you can get a feel for Broderick's work there. And if you're interested, the second one where I put there, Gilt's Tune, that isn't specifically a Glacier related link, but if you want to say get a feeling for the kind of work that Peter Broderick has done, I particularly like that second example there, Gilt's Tune. If you want to have a look at that just for fun. But let's push that forward a bit and say, well, okay, you've seen, you know a bit about Glaciers, you've now seen other artists responding to Glaciers in their way. Well, is there some way that we can carry it forward? And I found a nice example of that, where one of Peter Broderick's pieces of music has been taken up by a dance group, and it was actually used very successfully in a dance competition. There's a well, I think it's a fantastic video here of a dance group representing the idea of a glacier. And I'm not going to talk you through the dance and explain exactly what I think I'm looking at, but for me this is a really brilliant representation of things I associate with what's happening at a glacier margin, for example. So again, I put the link on there, and for Kiel students I'll put the links to all these videos on the KLE so that you can go and have a look at them. But this is a nice example of that connection from Glacier to the original artist who produced the music, and then that music, based on Glacier, then being used in a kind of a yet further development, if you like, of the art into, in this case, dance. And you might then follow this on. There you go, there's a great project for you. Do some third-hand art production and write a story or a poem or do something else which follows on from the dance, and see how far we can keep this going as the inspiration kind of rattles through from individual to individual, as we're communicating this shared imagery, this shared notion of what it is that's making a glacier, what's central to the nature of Glacier. Now, we've very quickly at the start of this session kind of moved away from what you might have expected to be the traditional story, especially coming from me, as a lot of you will think of me as a Glaciers chap, and you probably think, yeah, well, Glaciers at school, Glaciers at university even. We've talked very much about, well, I've put a few of the headings, if you like, on here, and a classic block diagram of a glacial environment, and some of you will be very, very familiar with me talking about the interconnected global system with glaciers as part of the hydrological cycle, glacial landforms, corries, arêtes, drumlins, moraines, erosion, deposition, all this kind of stuff. The facts, if you like, and there are literally books of the facts about rivers, glaciers, deserts, gardens, cities, the sky, love, hope, whatever topic you want to choose and think, well, this is geography, there'll be a book that purports to give you the facts about it. And that's one absolutely legitimate way of approaching the subject. And many of you doing this module will already have done some of that, and you'll be familiar, for example, with the history of that science. So you'll be familiar with the date 1840, a key date in the history of glacier studies, which is the date around when a chap called Louis Agassiz very much popularised the idea that glaciers do come and glaciers do go. They haven't always been stationary in the same positions that they were at right then. There had been ice ages in the past when glaciers were much bigger, and that glaciers can shrink. And it wasn't instantaneous in 1840. There were people before that who had thought that way, and the change didn't happen overnight. But basically we can divide our understanding of glaciers into those two periods, before and after 1840. It's a key moment in the history of understanding glaciers. But as late as 1863, so a quarter of a century after that date, there's still massive arguments going on about whether glaciers have expanded in the past or not, and certainly about whether they've affected the landscape. John Ruskin, the naturalist and art historian, art critic, he wrote in 1863, he said something like, a glacier can no more erode its bed than can a custard erode the dish in which it lies. I vaguely remember that being an exam question that I had to answer once. The Ruskin pie dish quote, discuss. Well, since then, again, those of you who've studied glaciers at all in the previous will know that changes in technology have been fundamental to developments in the science. So the development of ice coring technology, including work by Louis Agassiz, and moving onwards from there. When we started to be able to fly over glaciers or put satellites up to take fantastic satellite imagery of glaciers, the use of stable isotopes to analyse the chemistry. You'll know there is all this science, there's all this knowledge, there are all these facts, and there's a huge volume of that. And traditionally, for geographers looking at glaciers, those are the kinds of things that we would expect to be looking at. But don't worry, we're not going to. Not now. That was a different module. Many of you have done that, so we're going to do something else. The first thing I want to do, though, is just cast a little bit of well, not casting doubt on the science, I don't mean it that way, but just to throw a sideways glance at the science and just remind ourselves that science isn't as straightforward as journals and textbooks sometimes imply. The textbooks seem to indicate, well, there was a period of ignorance, then we did the work, and now we know stuff. It really wasn't that straightforward. And this is, again, this is from the Glacier book. And if you want to read up more detail on this, then pages 85 to 88 in that Glacier Nature and Culture book are about an interesting episode where some really fantastic work was done in the 1890s. There was a paper published in 1895 about the glacial tills on the Wirral Peninsula in northwest England, around a place called Thurston. And this photograph shows one of my dogs in front of the till cliff, the glacial deposits on the shoreline at Thurston. And it's a really impressive sequence of glacial deposits. And in 1895 a paper was written describing that sequence of glacial deposits and interpreting it and making decisions, making discoveries, making decisions on the basis of the evidence about whether this ice was floating on water or whether it was resting on land, and therefore what the sea level must have been, what the rocks within the till were and where they'd come from, and therefore what the direction of travel of the glacier must have been. It was a very detailed, very insightful paper. It was published in 1895, and as far as I know, it was simply forgotten. I'd never heard of it until I was doing research for this book, and I turned it up and started reading about it. And at the same time, doing the same research, I was reminded of, and I found again, another paper that had been published in 2001, and it was on exactly the same topic. But these 2001 21st century authors, they didn't know about that earlier paper. It was lost in the mists of scientific history. So it's an interesting question. That's why the first people did it. So these new people, they went and did it again. Well, they went and did it. They didn't know it was again. They went and did this work in around about 2000. And they published their paper 2001. So now, having recovered the old paper from the pit of forgotten knowledge, I was able to sit there and compare what they said in the first paper with what they said in the second paper. And it was quite astonishing to see how accurate, how well the 1895 paper had described and interpreted those glacial sediments. Even though it's 100 years later and we have all these new technologies, everything else, we go and do that work again. And in fact, we're just discovering exactly what we had discovered 100 years ago but then forgotten. And the history of progress in science it involves not only there are lots of mistakes that happen in science, but also there are lots of instances of these lost knowledges. We find something out, then we forget it again. It gets lost in this pit of scientific forgetfulness, and is then hopefully one day followed again by a reinvention, even though we're often just reinventing a wheel that we'd invented before, forgotten, lost, and now we needed to invent it again. So science is itself a really interesting thing to look at, not just in terms of what we're finding out, but this complex, messy way in which it proceeds. We find things out, we forget them, we get them wrong, we do it again, and so on. So science itself is not as straightforward as we think. But science is only one of many different ways of looking at glaciers. We're talking in this module about viewpoints, perspectives, and so on. And so I want to move away now from the scientific viewpoint, the scientific perspective. I'm going to take that for granted, take that as read, take that for granted. We all know about that. But science has been, well, in the last few hundred years, since the so-called Enlightenment, science has been overwhelming in its domination of popular understanding of our natural environment, and it's been neglectful, or we have been neglectful in our adoption of scientific thinking, we've been neglectful, many of us in many parts of the world, of traditional and indigenous points of view. So I've just thrown up a couple of books here, a couple of people's work, just to remind you that there is a literature on this that you can get into, and we'll be looking at this in different contexts later on in the module. But just now, to begin to pull ourselves away from this idea that science is the only way of looking at glaciers, people who do live and have lived in glacial environments since our prehistory, well, of course, they have been involved with glaciers on a day-to-day basis. I say in the book that most of the people reading this book probably aren't involved with glaciers on a day-to-day basis. Certainly most of you doing this module with me in the UK, we don't have any local glaciers. Glaciers are far away, or for the UK, they're long ago. But there are people throughout human history who have lived alongside and amongst glaciers. And of course they've had things to say about them. They've had views on glaciers, and we're deeply mistaken if we ignore and neglect those views. So Julie Cruikshank wrote this book, Do Glaciers Listen, in which she recounts indigenous stories about glaciers from the Pacific Northwest. And she tells stories from the local indigenous histories of glaciers taking deliberate action, glaciers being actors within the landscape and responding to human actions. There's a story of a girl who insults a glacier, so the glacier advances, comes down and demolishes the girl's village, and the population have to evacuate. And you can begin now even to imagine, even if we're trying to translate this into our difficult to shift scientific perspective, you can think, that must have been a glacier advance, and they're explaining it in this way. But the traditional story retains elements of those actual events, and also demonstrates to us a whole different approach to working with the environment around us. And we're going to talk about some of these indigenous viewpoints, these indigenous perspectives on landscape in some of our future sessions. And the book there by Patrick Nunn, a number of papers by Nunn and others, Nunn working with other people that you'll be able to find on the reading list. He's reporting stories from Australian Aboriginal traditional stories that have been handed down as an oral history, and he reconstructs 9,000 years worth of storytelling on the basis of what the stories are about. And there are stories about rich hunting grounds in certain specific spots in Australia, and if you look at the map now, well, that spot is underwater, and it's been underwater for 8,000 or 9,000 years, since the end of the last ice age, when the glaciers melted, sea level rose, and lots of land was inundated. But the traditional stories about hunting on that spot, well, those stories have continued to be told, and so the stories still exist, even though the land itself that they're talking about has gone. And there's a story that he recounts about a woman who crawls away to escape an advancing wall of water, an advancing tide of water. And it's thought that represents that period where sea levels were rising and people had to evacuate, had to migrate away from the rising shoreline. And those stories have been not recorded in writing or in any other form of that nature, but they've been told over and over again as oral histories. So we shouldn't think that human knowledge and understanding of glaciers only began in 1840. Obviously it's been going a lot longer than that, and not only should we be thinking about a scientific understanding of glaciers, there are lots of other human engagements, human involvements with glaciers going back into deeper history. So science is by no means all of it. We also need to think, just taking some different perspectives, we've got the science, we've got the indigenous viewpoints, but what about artistic viewpoints? That's something we're talking about a lot in this module. So for this module, it's important that we look at some non-scientific engagements with glaciers, some artistic engagement with glaciers. Now, we'll do that in a follow-on video and in one of our live sessions. So for now, if you haven't already done so, just go back and look at those videos that I put up earlier with the music and the dance related to glaciers, and try and have a think between now and the next session about what other examples you can find of poetry to do with glaciers, music to do with glaciers, dance to do with glaciers, cinema to do with glaciers. Find some of your own examples of glacier related art that you can hold up against the examples that I'm going to look at with you in our next session.